Hi, Dr. D back with Chapter 2. After the softball 13 pages of Chapter 1, Chapter 2 may make you wonder what these people are thinking, because it made me wonder that. Chapter 2 is really ambitious, especially if you don't have a very strong background in biology. It includes, and I kid you not, cell structure, cell biology, types of cells found in the body, histology, the types of tissues in the human body, and then finally, some things about anatomical directions and terms. That's in section 2.5. The first four sections assume that you have a pretty strong biology background. And if you don't, if you haven't had those topics in any depth, don't panic. The tables of word analysis and definition throughout Chapter 2 will have most of the terms you would need to know. To be honest, these are probably not the terms you will hear used most frequently in daily clinical settings. So you're thinking, well, why are they even in there? Many of you will be going on to have classes in pharmacology. Those of you who are going into radiology or radiographic careers will be learning about the effects of radiation, different types of imaging on cells. So to be familiar with these terms is helpful, particularly if you're reading things about how drugs work in the body. It's all good to know, but it's not our main goal for Chapter 2. The real important, you must know this to move ahead information is in Chapter 2.5, and that's where I'm going to be spending most of today talking about. This is going to be, I hope, a little multimedia show with a little fun. I encourage you, if I'm doing an activity, remember you can stop and start this recording, and believe me, you will remember more about things if you do them along with me. So if I have done a little activity and you think, yeah, I got this, it's not a bad idea to stop the recording, run it back, and see if you can actually imitate what I just did. So, without further ado, let's talk about some of the items in Chapter 2.5. So first, let me get this out of the way. I'm in my kitchen today, you'll see why. I want you to say hello to my little friend. Since I'm in my kitchen and not in a lab, I'm working with what I have. This is one of those little artist models, and I've doctored him up with a Sharpie just a bit. You can see that I'm not an artist, but I wanted you to be able to tell two important things. First, his front side from his back side. So I gave him an umbilicus or belly button and a face. The other thing, and I was less successful here, is that you need to be able to see how his hands are positioned, and he needed thumbs and fingers. You see that I'm not much of an artist, but I did take my little Sharpie and try to draw some hands on his little hands. We'll see about that. So the first thing you need to know, very important, is what is the anatomic position. The anatomic position, and there's a nice drawing in your text, says that you should be standing erect with arms at the sides, key point here, palms forward, thumbs outward, and feet either together or close together. So in the erect position, straight up and down, the tricky part is that your arms are at your side with the thumbs pointed outward. Now, how are you going to remember that? Because it's not really the way we usually stand naturally. One way might be to think if you're wanting to get stronger in your anatomic vocabulary, you might do some bicep curls. And to start a bicep curl, your hands would need to be in the anatomic position, thumbs outward. That's really the only tricky part. Well, why do you need to know that? Because next we're going to move on to body surfaces, and they assume that we're talking about a body to start with in the anatomic position. Another important point about this is in medical directions, there are many references to right and left. For instance, your heart is situated slightly to the left of your sternum or breastbone. Well, keep in mind that right and left, and this is really important, refer to the patient or the subject's right and left, not your right and left. So you have to get used to thinking that your right is the patient's left and vice versa. That becomes natural pretty quickly, but there have been some horrendous errors made, wrong limbs amputated, etc., because someone got a little confused about what was the right and what was the left. Again, you're talking about the patient's, the subject's right and left, not your right and left. Really important. Okay, then let's talk something that's probably also pretty evident to you. This is his anterior surface, and if I turn him around, he doesn't have real little cute butt there, but this is his posterior surface. No face, no belly button. So here he comes. Anterior surface, the back side is the posterior surface. Now in healthcare, we throw in two other terms that we actually use quite a bit, and these may not be quite as familiar to you: dorsal and ventral. Why do we need those? Well, I have two other little friends that I swiped from my grandchildren's toy box here. This is a Beanie Baby, and this is a Stegosaurus, and you will see this guy has tiny, tiny feet. He's a quadruped, and the Stegosaurus, also a quadruped, meaning they have 4 feet. They walk on 4 legs. Human beings, in the ideal situation, are bipeds. We walk on 2 legs. So for us, dorsal is our backside, ventral is our tummy side. I like to think tummy side and spine side. And you think, well, why do we need 2 different terms? Well, let's say that in biology we were talking about a quadruped, like my Stegosaurus friend here. Do you see if I said anterior and posterior, that could mean here and here rather than tummy and spine. So the terms dorsal and ventral can be used for any kind of organism that's built like a mammal, whereas anterior and posterior could be confusing. Anterior here might mean this critter's nose and eyes, and posterior, its cute little tail. Whereas dorsal and ventral, there's no doubt. Ventral is the tummy side, dorsal is the spine or back side. Now there's a couple ways to remember this. The easiest way for me is almost everybody knows that a shark has a dorsal fin on its back. If this were this is a Triceratops. I said he was a Stegosaurus. If this were a Stegosaurus, his little plates would be along the back. This guy's little hoodie thing, that's along the back side. So this is his dorsal surface, and his tummy side, isn't that cute? It's actually vented. That might help us remember. I didn't notice that. So that's his ventral side, is his tummy side. So going back to our semi-human friend here, this is his anterior or ventral tummy side. If we turn him around, that's his posterior dorsal spine side. And very often in healthcare, directions will be given not as anterior and posterior, but as dorsal and ventral. Important to know. All right, moving on. Now that we know what the surfaces of the body are called, we're going to work on some directional terms. These aren't too bad. Most of them pretty much common sense. Directional terms are always descriptive of one point in reference to another. You think, what does that mean? Well, suppose I said to you, is St. Louis east? Then you'd think, that question makes no sense. East of what? It's east of Los Angeles, but it's west of Louisville, Kentucky. So to say, is something east, you don't know unless you have another point of reference. And that's the way directional terms work in the body. It is one term, how it relates to the position of another term. Which direction are we moving, if you want to think of it that way? So, easy one, and I have some little arrows here to play with. Superior. If we are moving superiorly, stick it on you, I hope it'll stick on you, we would be moving upwards. So it can be referenced in any 2 points on the body in the anatomical position. My nose is superior to my chin, and my chin is superior to my neck. Does that make sense to you? We could do it if I wanted to stand up. I'm not going to. We could say his hip is superior to his knee. The opposite of superior, obviously, is inferior, and it means exactly the opposite. that something, oops, that something is below something else, that we are moving in a downward direction. So, to go back to his knee and hip, his knee is inferior to his hip, and his hip is inferior to his shoulder. So inferior means we're moving downward. If you looked at a map of the United States, you could say Florida is inferior to New York, and New York is superior, maybe, to Florida. I guess that could have other overtones. Okay, so superior and inferior, not hard, right? All right, the other ones that we use sometimes to mean the same thing, honestly not as often, but you will hear them used, are terms if we're moving up the body. Let's turn it around again. We sometimes say that that's cranial, that we are moving in a cranial direction. Even less commonly, you will hear cephalad or cephalid, depending on how the person pronounces it. So you will hear those terms used as well. So cranial means that way, up towards your cranium, the top of your skull. What's the opposite of that? It's kind of funny, really. The opposite of cranial is to move in the caudal direction, which is toward the tail. Now, most of us don't have tails, but if we had one, you know where it would be. So caudal means toward the inferior part of your trunk. You will hear in, say, obstetrics, sometimes they will put in a caudal block to numb the lower part of the body, and that's what they're talking about, the area down there, the lower part of the trunk, the floor of the torso, if you will. So you will hear cranial, less often cephalid. You will also hear caudal, sometimes used, but mostly you'll hear superior, inferior, and that's pretty straightforward. All right, this next part isn't hard either. This is pretty common sense also. What about if we're moving sideways? Well, if you're moving toward the outside of the body, come up here, let's say we're moving from his chest over to, come on honey, stick, his shoulder, that would be moving in a lateral direction. My hands right now are lateral to my ears, not in the anatomic position, but just to show you. Lateral means to the side. And if you're a football fan, that's a pretty easy one because you know that a lateral pass is when the quarterback throws it off to the side, not down the field. So lateral means to the side. The opposite of lateral would be medial, toward the middle of the body. And that would be like a median in a highway. Where is it? It's not down the sides, it's right down the middle. So medial means toward the middle. So an example right here, my nose is medial to my ears, and my ears are lateral to my nose. You need to practice a few of those on yourself or your dog or the body of your beloved if you want to have fun, and make sure that you understand medial and lateral. Occasionally, we will use the term intermediate to mean partway between two other points. So I guess let's see if I can do one here. I could say my nose is medial to my ear is lateral to my nose, but my cheekbone is intermediate to my nose and my ear. Intermediate meaning between 2 points. Again, not something to get hung up on. Okay, let's see what else we have. The last one's the easiest of all. You already know this. Superficial and deep. If I said to you, okay, I'm going to use this in a minute for something else, not on you, but I'm coming after you with this knife, and I'm going to cut you, and I'm going to either do it a superficial cut or a deep cut. You'd rather have no cut, obviously, but if we have to be injured, we'd rather it be a superficial injury than a deep injury. Superficial simply means closer to the surface of the body. Deep means deeper, I don't know another way to say it, more toward the innards of the body, if you will. So superficial and deep are two other directional terms we sometimes use. Now for the most fun part of this lesson, and that's talking about body sections and planes. We tend to use those terms interchangeably. Technically, they're not. Technically, the plane is the actual cut itself, or the actual direction of the cut, the imaginary window pane, if you will, that we are placing through the body, whereas a section is you've gone ahead and done the cut. But most of the time, that's a pretty picky distinction. If you understand one, you'll understand the other. Why is that important? Well, in the textbooks that you're going to be viewing throughout your medical career, you are going to see images that say a certain section or a certain view. And if you don't have any notion of what are we looking at, you're not going to learn very much from studying that drawing. So this, I think, will become apparent as we go along. This could get messy. All right, for this exercise or this demo, we are going to use this plate of Twinkies. And I chose Twinkies for several reasons. One, my husband adores them and I don't particularly. So he was very excited about this lesson because I promised him that he will have access to the carnage and debris after we finish doing this. The other reason I chose Twinkies is that they're shaped roughly like the torso or trunk of a human body. And it's clear that they have little buttons up the front of their Twinkie shirt and their back does not. So you can tell the front of the Twinkie from the back of the Twinkie. And if I designate it, it does have a top and a bottom. So we're going to practice some ways that the body can be sectioned or cut through different planes by using Twinkies. You might want to go get a cucumber or a Twinkie or whatever you've got that's roughly this shape in your kitchen and follow along with me. Otherwise, watch the video and when we're finished, find something and practice. Why do I stress that? A little aside here. You know, you have a certain number of neurons up there, and I'm hoping that this class is using quite a few of them. When you read a term, one set of neurons clicks on and says, okay, we're working on this. When you say a term, another set of neurons in a completely different part of your brain click in and join that team of learning that word. When you hear me say it, again, hearing the term, some in your auditory part of your brain click on. And then when you actually have to use your sense of touch, maybe even smell and taste to work on something, a whole nother group of neurons gets activated. The bigger the team of neurons in your brain you have working on a concept, the more likely it is to stay with you. So I know it's tempting to just say, okay, she did that, I got it. But I promise you, you will have it better if you actually try this yourself. End of sermon. All right, so let's talk about sections. And I do have a whiteboard here somewhere. There he is. I've got all kinds of stuff today. The first section we're going to talk about is called a sagittal section. And I'll write it. There's also a very nice video in your Chapter 2 folder on Blackboard where another gentleman does a very good job of explaining what I'm about to explain. So you might want to watch that as well if you're at all confused. So there's the word sagittal. Sagittal has one G and two T's. People misspell this word all the time. Where does the word come from? You know, I like that. It comes from, if you spoke Latin, you would say sagitta, which means an arrow, and Sagittarius in Latin, or Sagittarius, means an archer. If you're an astrology fan, you know Sagittarius is one of the zodiac signs which features an archer. Now, if you know the story of William Tell, you know that he had to shoot an apple off his son's head with an arrow, and he did it beautifully. The arrow cut the apple exactly into two halves, and the child did not die in the story of William Tell. Well, sagittal means if you shot an arrow right down the middle of something, it would divide it into two halves. And there's a little clue right in the middle of the word. Do you see those two T's? Move your hand. There we go. Those two T's, they actually, if you split them right down the middle, would divide that double letter set into two equal halves. So let's try it with a Twinkie. I'll do it and then I'll show you what I've done. So I have my Twinkie looking at me like this. This is his front side, right? And I'm going to take this and try to go right down the middle. I've got a cutting board here of his little shirt buttons. And I'll show you what happened. There's the Twinkie. And when I open it up, you can see pretty close, right down the middle, I cut him into two equal halves. A sagittal section is also sometimes called a median section, and you can see why. But most of the time in healthcare, when you see a drawing, it's going to say sagittal section. You can see if you're trying to show the internal organs of the body, a sagittal section is a really useful one to have. So a term you need to be familiar with, and that's one Twinkie down. The next term is a frontal section. So suppose I want to cut this Twinkie again in two, but instead of a right and left half, I want a front and a back half. That is called a frontal section. So let's do that and I'll show you the difference. Ooh, it's getting messy. Okay. So here's my, maybe it's not, intact Twinkie, but I have cut him into front and back pieces. So instead of right and left, side to side, I've cut him into front and back. And that is called a frontal section. Now, of course, we can't leave well enough alone. We can also call that a coronal section. Why would that be? Well, you think, what word do I know that kind of sounds like that? You know what a coronation is? It's when a king or a queen is crowned. So you think, yeah, what a crown? What? Well, you have to think again about back at the time these terms were created. We think of crowns now, and since medieval times, they're like a Burger King crown that sits on your head thusly. But back then, crowns, think about a laurel wreath. Crowns were like what we would call a tiara. I wish I had one here, but I seem to have misplaced my tiara. So picture that I have a tiara on my head, and if it were really sharp and I pushed down hard enough, creepy, I could cut it into front and back sections. Coronal is used particularly, not exclusively, but particularly when we're referring to the head. For those of you who plan a career in radiography, if we want to look at all of someone's sinuses, if we think they've got a sinus problem going on, we want a CT or CAT scan that is a frontal view, not a side-to-side view, but a frontal view, and that's often called a coronal CT scan or coronal CAT scan. So you will hear that term used, and they mean the same thing. But what tends to happen is, if we're talking about the whole body, we tend to use frontal for front and back. If we're talking about the head in particular, you will hear the term coronal. We're almost there. All right. The next one is super easy. Another Twinkie victim. He's intact, as you can see. Sometimes we want to cut things into tops and bottoms. You can think about the old magician's trick where he puts a lady in a box and pretends to saw her in half. We don't know how he does it, but it's very impressive. So this is called, it has several different names, a horizontal section because you're cutting just like there was a horizon across. It can be called a horizontal section. It can also be called a transverse section, again, top and bottom. And finally, and most easily, a cross section. So whether you call it a transverse or a horizontal or a cross section, what you've done is cut your Twinkie into top and bottom pieces, right? Pretty easy. So last, and this one is used least of all, but for special views, and you use this in radiography as well as in medical illustration, sometimes something, well, here's an intact guy again, my husband's going to love this, you want to show something where it doesn't lie in one of those planes we just covered. If you wanted to get a picture, say, of a particular area in someone's lung or a particular part, all the valves of the heart in one view, that would be another example. If you need an image or a section that's not going to be straight up and down, straight front and back, straight top and bottom, but on what we call the diagonal, and you sometimes hear that, but it's also called an oblique, which just means diagonal. So one last Twinkie is going to go under the knife, and my husband is just going to gorge on all these. We have a diagonal or oblique section. Can you see that? So those are the sections that we use. So I think I've pretty much covered all the things I wanted to talk with you about. There are a couple of picky things that I'm not crazy about in chapter 2 involving pronunciation. Most of the pronunciations I think are really well done, and if you say the words as they're written in their guides, you're going to be pretty close. But there are 3 in chapter 2 where I think one of them is just an error, and I've called it to the publisher's attention. A cytologist is a person who studies cells. A histologist is a person who studies tissues, and that's a pretty picky difference, but it is important. So if you're a person who looks at a cell and another kind of cell, you look at cells as individuals, you are a cytologist. The problem in your book is that they put the emphasis on the first syllable, and if you try to say it that way, it's almost impossible. It'd be a cytologist. Nobody says cytologist, it's cytologist. The other 2 may have to do with the background of the people who wrote the book. And they're acceptable, but they're not, when I've checked with other pronunciation guides on the internet, they're not what we hear most commonly. It doesn't hurt to know that people say things a little differently. But one is, they say for deoxyribonucleic acid or ribonucleic acid, tongue twisters, DNA and RNA for short, or nucleic or anything like that, they tend to say clee, whereas most speakers in our area are going to say clay. Either one is acceptable. So you can say nucleic acid, which is the way I learned it and hear it, I think, most often. But you can also say nucleic acid. I guess that sounds a little more erudite. Finally, and this one was kind of strange, for the word nutrient, their pronunciation is nutrient with a little Y stuck in there. And that's acceptable, but the preferred pronunciations that I could find were actually nutrient, like NEW rather than NYU, nutrient. But if you want to say it either way, it's fine. I just thought that might be confusing to you. I think that's all I had to draw your attention to, especially in Chapter 2. Make sure that you do your practice exercises, your review questions. The things I want you to know from the parts of the chapter not covered in this lecture are covered in the review questions. And as always, if you have questions for me, you can email me, or if you think they're of general interest to the class, we have a discussion board especially for that. So hope you have enjoyed this, and I hope you will get out your Barbie or G.I. Joe and practice the directional terms. And I hope you'll find something in your kitchen you can cut up, or some Play-Doh, to practice the sections and planes. Have fun.